So good evening. I'm Tim Rogers. I'm chairman of the Friends Committee, and I want to welcome you to the Danforth Conversation Center. This is the Conversation Center, features leading experts in plant science and related disciplines, speaking on topics of regional and global urgency, and I'd underscore that word urgency. That's the thing that I think with a place like this that's so devoted to long-term projects and prospects that we lose the sense that these are all very urgent matters. Surprise to me that this program has been going on since 2003. It's given the public the opportunity to learn about the work of the center and all of its partners, and I will tell you, we are very glad you're here tonight. To those of you who are new to events here at the Danforth Center, and you'll see this throughout the night, our mission is to improve the human condition through plant science. Danforth Center scientists passionately go about their work to feed the world, to develop renewable energy sources, and to discover plant-based medical solutions, all while preserving and renewing our environment. One of the ways we can achieve this, and our fascinating conversations topic for tonight, is by bringing science to the smallholder farmers of the world. So we're here to talk about how this works on the smallest level, in addition to some of the larger projects you're familiar with. Tonight's program will be moderated by Natalie DiNicola, Chief Communications Officer of Benson Hill Biosystems, and will feature Dr. Ruth Kaggwa, a Danforth Center STEM Education and Outreach Manager. Ruth joined the Danforth Center in 2015. She has a PhD in plant science from the University of Arizona, and her other degrees are from Makerere University in Kampala. I hope I got that right, I tried. Uganda, where she grew up. And our other guest is Dr. Donald MacKenzie, Director of the Institute for International Crop Improvement at the Danforth Center. Don joined the Danforth Center in 2008 after serving as head of regulatory affairs for the Golden Rice Project. He obtained his PhD in biochemistry from the University of British Columbia. Now, given that this is called the Conversation Series, and if you're like me, I don't have a PhD in anything, you might be a bit intimidated to start a conversation with our panelists and their advanced degrees. So I asked each of them to give us a conversation starter that did not involve intimate knowledge of advanced microbiology or where they went to high school. So Natalie tells me that she is obsessed with the octopus. She went scuba diving, and ever since she has been, I guess, the octopi. I'm not sure that that's right. So don't be passing any calamari to her later on. Ruth tells me that the food she misses most from home is matoke. Got it? A dish of steamed green bananas. So take that, crown candy. And I learned that Don was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Royal Diamond Jubilee Medal for contributions to Canadian agriculture, and he assures me you can ask him anything about Meghan Markle. Before we get to the program, we want to have a few thank yous to make. Thanks to our Friends Committee. I think that's me thanking myself, but that's what it says. And to the Conversations Committee for their continued support and commitment to this program, which, as I said, goes all the way back to 2003. Thank you to the media sponsors of the Conversation Series, St. Louis Public Radio and HEC Media. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie to lead the discussion on small farmers.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Great to have you all here. We're going to have a great conversation about what I think is one of the most fascinating places in the world, and that is Africa. And while many of us might think that that seems really far away and removed from our lives, this part of the world is going to become ever increasingly important to all of us. I think we're going to hear more and more about it in the news. And let me just share a few of the statistics why. So by 2030, which is just about 10 years from now, 1 in 5 people will be African. And by 2035, the number of young people reaching working age in Africa will exceed that of the rest of the world combined and will continue every year for the rest of the century. Between now and 2050, 2 billion babies are going to be born in Africa, and the continent will double its population. And by the end of the century, nearly 40% of the world's population will be African. So it's really no wonder that Bloomberg article mentioned or noted, the future of Africa is synonymous with the future of the human race. And it's really important for us to recognize the kinds of challenges that the continent is facing. It is still the continent with the highest prevalence of malnutrition, affecting 1/5 of the population, hundreds of millions of people. Earlier this summer, some of you might have seen a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they talked about the world's food security increasingly at risk due to climate change. And I think many of us know Africa is one of the most vulnerable areas for drought, but also floods. So really at the core of what's going to be so important to all of us is food production on that continent by smallholder farmers there, who make up, in some of those countries, up to 80% of the population. Here in the United States, maybe 2% of our population is directly involved in agriculture. In some of these countries, up to 80% of the people. Agriculture is responsible for about 30% of the GDP in some of these countries. And yet their harvests are the lowest in the world. In some cases, 50% or less than what you can see in other parts of the world. And it certainly is not due to lack of labor and toil. It's about having the kinds of tools and the opportunities to them to do what they can do there. And we're really fortunate today to have two individuals, colleagues from the Danforth Center, who are intimately familiar with the challenges and the opportunities of improving food production in Africa. Thankfully, the Danforth Center had the foresight to invest in this kind of research a long time ago, a decade or so ago, and they're going to tell us more about that and what it's like working there. So we'll start with you, Ruth. Really excited to have you here because you grew up in Uganda, and you've seen the life of a smallholder for yourself, what that's like. Tell us all, what does that look like? What's the life in the day, a day in the life of a smallholder, and how important, what role does agriculture and food production play there beyond just maybe having more choices in the grocery store, as we might think of it?
Oh my. First, I have to thank Jim for this opportunity. It's a great opportunity, and thank you all, the audience, for spending your evening with us. It's a great opportunity to talk about smallholder farming because for Uganda's case, agriculture is actually the backbone of the economy. Just like you mentioned, the nation derives majority of its income from agricultural exports. And yet a majority of this farming is actually smallholder nation. So you might think to yourself, what's smallholder farming? So this is really small parcels of land, less than 20 acres, and so typically growers or farmers are growing mixed crops and just have the lowest inputs possible. So if you think about farming here in the Western world and the sophistication of it and the precision of it and the gadgetry, so you want to think about the opposite of that, and that's going to be the smallholder farming style. So it's just the basics, and costs are kept at their lowest. And so as you can imagine, with that kind of scenario, agriculture is primarily usually rain-fed and smallholder farming, predominantly dominated by women and their children. And so because women always feel the obligation to take care of their children, to feed their children. And so the goals here with smallholder farming are usually to be able to get enough food to feed your children. And so the women will dominate because of that. They feel the responsibility to do that. And so children of school-going age end up usually also sort of being the source of labor for smallholder agriculture because there's just not much labor available, plus labor is expensive. So if you have a 10-acre field, this farmer is going to look to his family to till that land, weed the crop, and harvest it. And so it's very dependent on the families and the children of school-going age for its success. And so the goals are usually to feed the family or to sell the produce to be able to generate an income. And so you can imagine, I have an aunt Rhoda, who is a clear example of really the leaning heavily on the family, who had a rice cultivation business going. And so she was a smallholder growing rice year after year, and the labor was none other than all her children. And so everybody had a 4 a.m. wake-up call to get ready and be out in the field, tilling the land, cultivating rice, and then 7:30 a.m. you'd be right back at the house, getting ready for school. These children would then go to school, and then right after school was dismissed, the cycle started all over again. They were back into the field until it was dark, and the cycle would repeat itself. And so can you imagine that is actually very typical of a lot of families. And so here, the challenge is because there's not enough labor, the operation starts to scale up, and whenever there's peak demand for labor, everybody else needs the labor because everybody else has that peak demand. And so challenges start to arise when these demands for labor in the agriculture business overlap with the examination period, education process for the children. And can you imagine what would be the priority? The smallholder farming. The rice harvest takes priority. And so can you imagine those children and what happened to their education process? Not very good. A majority dropped out of school. I don't even think that they knew about careers in agriculture because they could have harvested all of that experience. So that's kind of what is the predominant sort of story, just those challenges and just the sort of deficiency in knowledge, sort of the intimate knowledge of a crop, to where one can predict or just customize it to the right planting density, the right fertilizer, the right water it needs to get the most out of it. That deficiency ends up actually resulting into sort of lower yields than optimal than we would typically get. And so those are some of the challenges that we have. I mean, we have challenges with even just access to resources, which is why the Danforth Center is great in trying to alleviate that, providing some of those resources, scientific resources and improved varieties to these growers, because that's usually a bigger challenge, and yet the need is great. And so
So let's talk a little bit about that.
yeah.
Because you mentioned, the challenge of children having access to education.
Yes.
And the incredibly important role science does play and will play in
Yeah.
improving agriculture there. Yeah. And thankfully, you found your way to that, and you've pursued a career in science. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your journey, your story, and how you landed here at the Danforth Center.
I could sit here for days. My story is but as I was reflecting on today, trying to think about my story, I was reminded of a saying we have in Uganda that loosely translated says that something that you plant reluctantly oftentimes will yield a harvest that you will eat. So you plant it reluctantly, but many times it will actually yield a harvest that you will eat. And so what that means is that oftentimes a lot of these sort of difficult experiences, endeavors that we take on grudgingly, reluctantly, give us rewards that we didn't, more than we expected, rewards that are greater than what we ever even imagined, that we end up enjoying. And so it's kind of the theme of my story, because I grew up in Uganda, obviously from a family of 5, single parent home. My mother was a sole income earner. We were in a lower middle class family because she was an administrator at a bank. Life was good. She had us enrolled in boarding school, as was the norm, by age 6. We purchased all our food from the farmer's market. And so I had no connections to agriculture or farming, really. I had no solid connections. I had never met any professional in agriculture, so I didn't even know about that as a career. And so until all of that changed. And so life's moving on swiftly, sweetly, until my mother lost her job. And that just was very devastating. She was a sole income earner. I mean, there was 5 of us, my mother, and then we had live-in help who had a child. So this is a family of 8 without a source of income. So my mother took her then a small severance package, moved us out of the city, purchased a house in a rural village. And this house was unfinished. 1 access door, no single window. So can you imagine like the growth chambers, except the growth chambers here at the center are more fancy. They have, and as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, oh, maybe it's something like a growth chamber because it has just the 1 access door. But I was like, no, growth chambers are fancy. We had no lights. We used the hurricane lamps for lighting. And so, and the roof was leaky. The growth chambers don't leak. Well, I guess they do leak sometimes during watering. So. And so this was our life. And so she moved us out to that because that's what she could afford. And so this started my journey with farming, smallholder farming. We had to till the land. So she met a distant relative that leased us a ½ acre of land, and we got to work. We couldn't afford to buy food, so we had to grow it. And so we started to plant sweet potatoes. We grew sweet potatoes. We ate sweet potatoes. And this was hard life because we didn't even have the luxury of heating the sweet potatoes up on a fancy stove. We had to gather dried up twigs and branches to cook the sweet potato. So I'm an expert at what kinds of twigs and tree branches will cook you a good meal. You know, like those nature versus wild, man versus wild shows. So we were cooking outside. And so I reflect on all those experiences when I sit in my house here in St. Louis with a fireplace that's just a luxury. And I think about how, you know, we were cooking. And that's really the life for most smallholders. So we were, you know, I learned to gather firewood to make dinner. I learned to till the land. I learned to roast sweet potatoes under huge piles of weeds. I learned to snack on ground cherries while out in the field. I learned to carry an 8-gallon jerry can on top of my head and balance it well as we fetched water because obviously, you know, it's an unfinished house. There was no water. So it was a tough life, and this was, you know, during our breaks, and so we were kind of going through these experiences, raising our food, and at a time I looked at farming as a chore. Really, this was farming to me at the time. Crop cultivation was a chore. It was toil. It was hard work. I couldn't even think of a career in plant sciences at the time. That was my attitude towards farming. And so my career aspirations at the time were in engineering because, you know, I once had witnessed an electric pole utility worker climb up a pole with spiky boots, and I thought, ooh, I would like to do that one day, have some fancy boots and climb up an electric pole and fix whatever it is up there. So I aspired to be an engineer because I wanted to do that. And so I kept on with my engineering dream, informed by just that experience until my mother figured that, you know, that needed to change, that I needed to aspire towards medicine because my late father was a medical doctor and medicine is highly esteemed in Uganda. And so I carried on with my medical aspirations until I graduated high school, was ready to get into college, and got a merit-based scholarship to study agriculture in university. I was like, okay, I'm gonna take this up. Let's see what happens. And so I take up agriculture, get through college, and right when I graduate, I get an offer to work with smallholder farmers in rural Uganda. Now, these farmers had just been resettled from years of civil strife and social unrest. Farms had been abandoned, there was food insecurity, and so the opportunity was to evaluate very low-cost cropping systems, minimal input that they could plant and get a good harvest, get a solid food intake that was nutritionally balanced, sustainable. And so I was like, ooh, I'm all in. What crops are we going to evaluate? You'll never guess the crops. Sweet potato again. And by the way, I had so much I felt like I'd had enough of sweet potatoes, with growing up and having to eat them every day and cultivate them every day, that I remember going to high school, because I was, going to high school and seeing one time a meal of sweet potatoes in the cafeteria and going, no, I'm allergic to sweet potatoes. No, I can't eat sweet potatoes again. I'm allergic to sweet potatoes. And so... And so that was just like, oh my goodness, sweet potatoes, okay. And so we worked with these farmers in rural Uganda, farm families, and it was interesting just to see their excitement and engagement and involvement in these new ideas and scientific resources and optimal cropping systems. And so there was a lot of excitement and engagement, which really gives me hope and encouragement that farmers really are interested in technology, they're interested in scientific advancement, they're interested in the help that we generate. And so it's exciting that the center here partners with farmers, even in Uganda, because the appetite's great and they're very interested. And so we work with farmers, farm families. We evaluated sweet potatoes and pigeon peas successfully. We broke ground in fields that had been abandoned for years, where people had fled, successfully got gardens established. And so this was a very rewarding experience for me, that I started to think about how agriculture, plant science can make a difference and does make a difference, an immediate difference. And so I started to think about that very seriously. But yet I didn't still feel the passion for plant science until I got admitted into the graduate program at the University of Arizona and started to study plant science doctorate. That I started to get into the sort of the advanced knowledge of plants and plant development and signaling and the genetics, the intricacy, the complexity. And I thought, oh my, plants are very interesting and fascinating.
Even the sweet potato.
Even the sweet
So I want to let Don talk a little bit about his experience on this, about working with women in Africa. So I think very inspiring story, and I feel bad that you have to follow in her footsteps. However, I know you have a really exciting or inspiring story as well. But tell us a little bit about your engagement with scientists, in particular women scientists in Africa, because they do play a really critical role, especially given that many of the farmers in Africa are actually women too.
Okay. Thanks, Natalie. And I'm not sure at all how I can follow up Ruth's fantastic story and your journey. I think it perfectly illustrates how women will absolutely take the opportunities offered and through science and that to move ahead. But my story goes back about 15 years or so ago now. And it involves a couple of scientists that I work with. Anne Kangiri, who worked at that time with the Kenya Plant Health Inspection Service. That's an organization that's analogous to USDA APHIS. So they're responsible for plant health and quarantine. The other scientist was Roshan Abdullah. And she worked with the Tropical Pest Research Institute in Tanzania, again in a similar kind of a regulatory role. And at that time, about 15 years ago, both of their organizations and their countries were interested in how to start up and manage regulated field trials of genetically modified or genetically engineered plants. and they had not much experience or any experience at that point in time. So we brought both Anne and Roshan, well, where else? To Canada to learn how to properly manage regulated field trials. And we worked with inspectors from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and we gave them exposure firsthand to regulated field trials of genetically engineered corn or maize, as well as genetically modified canola. And they learned firsthand how those trials were managed. And then they worked with us and they developed the guidelines and the standard operating procedures for their agencies back home on how to manage these kinds of activities. And in fact, the work that they did built the foundation for how Kenya and Tanzania manage confined field trials or regulated field trials of bioengineered crops today. So it was really important work that they did, and continued to work for KEFIS for another 5 years or so, up until about 2010. And then she went and got her doctorate in the UK, and she's now a senior research fellow at the African Center for Technology Studies, based in Nairobi. So she's had quite the journey from her beginnings in KEFIS as the biosafety or a regulatory manager to now having gotten her advanced degree and being a senior fellow. Roshan likewise has stayed very active in Tanzania. She currently serves as the country coordinator for the Program for Biosafety Systems, which is a USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, funded program delivered through the International Food Policy Research Institute to help build capacity within government institutions on how to regulate genetically engineered crops. And she's also the executive director of an agricultural innovation research foundation based in Tanzania. So both of these women have really taken full advantage of all of the opportunities that they've gotten over years and made significant contributions to agriculture, to policy and education in their countries. So Ruth, I would ask you a question, and as you think about STEM and your work here at the Danforth Center, are there opportunities you think where we could work with organizations in your home country of Uganda or elsewhere to try and help sort of stimulate and get sort of more girls and women interested in science and following the career paths that you've had, for example?
I think there are great opportunities. I think when I think of like my story, I just had no role model. I had nobody's story to reflect on or to inspire me, or to, nobody in my family, and so, or a relative or stranger. So I think that, maybe providing role models that are in the field, that are scientists like myself, and that can, talk to these girls, students about the career and the opportunities there are in the career, I feel is a great way to start. And so the more role models, which is why I feel like, the capacity building, the training of scientists that the center is doing is just fantastic, especially for international students, because it's increasing these role models, these professionals that, their families, their friends of families can see, and then, hopefully lead them towards those career paths. Yeah.
I think you could be one of those great role models. I mean, it really is pretty interesting. Some of the, again, I like the statistics a lot, but Africa has some of the most women entrepreneurs of anywhere in the world, and it also has some of the best statistics in terms of the number of women in parliament, which is pretty interesting around the world. Yeah. So Don, I want to go back though to the institutions that you mentioned, some of these regulators and what, and heard you talk about the fact that these policymakers can have as much impact really on food production on the continent as the farmers themselves. I've also seen up close myself from my travels there, the role that the Danforth Center plays as a sort of a trusted partner with a lot of these institutions. So can you tell us a little bit about how you work with them and the kind of role they play?
Sure. So what I want to do is maybe sort of to try and answer that, take a couple of examples from different parts of Africa that I hope will illustrate sort of the different roles, if you will, or the different impacts that policymakers, politicians, and that have had on access to innovation by smallholder farmers. And so the first example I'll use is from Nigeria. And I'm going to just sort of preface this by saying just a few words about beans, or we'd call them black-eyed peas here, or perhaps the scientists would call them cowpeas. A lot of folks in West Africa might also call them poor person's meat, because they are a tremendous source of protein, minerals, and vitamins. And these beans are a staple food for many people living in countries in West Africa, such as Ghana, or Burkina Faso, or Nigeria. And the problem is that the crop is routinely devastated by an insect pest that can cause up to 90% of yield loss. And so through work that's been ongoing to develop improved varieties of cowpea through using biotechnology approaches, new varieties of cowpeas have been produced that are resistant to the insect pest. And importantly in this, and to illustrate sort of the role of smallholders, is that smallholder farmers in Nigeria and in Ghana have not only been able to see the technology in action, but they have been involved in what we would call participatory plant breeding. So they've actually been involved firsthand in working with the scientists there to select the best looking, best performing of these new varieties, because it's important then to help build a sense of familiarity and ownership with it. So where do the policymakers come into this story? And it's really because these varieties are regulated. And luckily, the government of Nigeria has taken a very science-based approach to regulating genetically engineered crops. And so they've recently approved for commercialization these new pest-resistant varieties of cowpea. And so these smallholder farmers that have been involved in evaluating the new varieties and even in helping select them will actually be getting their hands on them for the first time to try them themselves, probably within the next year or so. So that's a really good story about the impact that technology can make. Our role, which has kind of been a very small role, but important, I think, has been to help get these products through the regulatory system in Nigeria. So I want to go to the other side of the continent now, to your hometown, or home country, Uganda, and talk a little bit about another crop, cassava. So how important is cassava in Uganda?
No, cassava and sweet potatoes.
Okay. You're going to put it in the same category
they're
as sweet
down
potatoes?
there as poor man crops, so.
So cassava is it's a tuberous, starchy root crop. It's a staple food for, I think, about 800 million people around the world. And most of those people are of course, living in different countries in Africa. It's a crop that's also devastated by an important disease called cassava brown streak disease. And using technology developed here at the Danforth Center, we've been working with research institutes in Uganda and in Kenya to develop new varieties or new cultivars of cassava that are resistant to brown streak disease. And I think there may even be another slide, Tam, that might illustrate the disease. And what we can see here is that sad-looking specimen on the left is a sliced open piece of cassava root showing the rot essentially caused by this disease, which makes the cassava absolutely inedible, unsaleable, of no value at all to the farmer that just spent the last 12 months trying to cultivate this in his garden. The happy-looking fellow on the right is the chairman of a local district farmers association who was visiting a harvest of these improved cassava that took place at one of the research stations in Uganda just a month or two ago. And you can see he's totally embracing the technology. He can appreciate the value of it firsthand right then and there. It's pretty obvious. I think he'd like to take some home and give it to the farmers in his district immediately. The challenge, though, is, Ruth, how can we get the president of Uganda to embrace this technology as well as the farmers are embracing it? Because that is, a little bit of the challenge at the moment, is that, we're able to introduce new innovations and technologies that can readily be appreciated by smallholders and that. But sometimes because of ideology or politics, or perhaps even the perceptions around technology that may be held by Europeans or others, policymakers and politicians are sometimes a little reticent to see these technologies adopted, and maybe don't appreciate fully sort of the value that they might bring to their own people.
Yeah, it's true actually. Now that you're talking about misconceptions, I was speaking to a corn grower, a smallholder corn grower in Uganda recently, and he said to me, well, those improved varieties are very heavy feeders of the soil. So they leave a soil very drained that you can't get a decent harvest of the next crop. So, and who can afford to buy fertilizers? So that's why they're not popular. And then he said, and something else that I wanted to tell you is, when we plant these improved varieties, everything else around them seems to suffer adverse effects. So all the local varieties around in the neighborhood of the improved varieties seem to suffer adverse effects from these improved varieties. What are these improved varieties doing? And so I thought these are misconceptions, because a crop is not sending off any adverse effects to its neighbors. So I asked him, had you taken any kind of observation, any data on how poorly these plants were doing before you planted the improved one? So this is like maybe the effects, the differences are exaggerated now that you have a better performing one. So you can see more drastically the differences. And so it's those misconceptions, plus purchasing counterfeit products that don't live up to their billing, that I feel like will taint the name of scientific resources, authentic scientific resources. So then there's really a role for trusted partners in distributing the right materials and providing guidance, instruction, clear instruction, I feel, that can help to alleviate a lot of those challenges.
I remember the first time I went to Africa, I was pregnant, and I met with a commissioner whose entire district's all agriculture, and he asked me if I must be worried about my baby because I was eating GMO varieties, and they cause you to have babies with two heads. And I said, how did you hear that? And he said somebody had come through with a backpack, was traveling across the continent, and came to his office and told him that. So there's a really important role in just trying to help share information and address these misconceptions.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think the story is that it's different in all of these countries, many of these countries, that it's rife with misinformation or lack of information and that. And I think, one of the comparative advantages that we as the Danforth Center have in all of our work that we're doing, whether it's in Uganda or Kenya or Nigeria or anywhere else, it's all about collaboration. And it's all about making sure that, we're working on important crops for the region or the country, that we're working to support the local agricultural research organizations and research institutes to bring these products forward as their own. And I think that is going to have a big difference as some of these public sector products now, such as whether this disease-resistant cassava or the pest-resistant cowpea or other products come forward from the public sector, from the national research institutes in these countries, that I think they're going to have a different reception than perhaps products that are being introduced from abroad, and that through mainly commercial interests in that. Not that those products aren't important and valuable as well, but sometimes perception is really important about on how things are accepted.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think we can say about our audience is that they're interested in these global challenges and trying to make an impact. And certainly one of the best ways they can make an impact is through supporting the center, which we're really grateful for. But you work in this area every day. I was wondering if you had any other thoughts or advice for things that our audience members could do that could make a difference in our everyday.
I'd encourage the audience to just really spend time kind of learning about smallholder farming and smallholder farmers. They're really the majority of families and women out there in the world. That'd be very enriching. Supporting them also would be through purchasing orphan crops. Orphan crops are critical to just really even enriching our diets, building resilience of our crop base.
Help them know what orphan crops are.
So orphan crops are these crops like millet, sorghum, cassava that haven't really received much research attention. And so they haven't been developed well. We don't really know their full potential. And so because they're grown usually in these a lot of these smallholder settings, and so they're not like your regular corn, soybean. They haven't been that well studied. A lot of their genomes haven't been sequenced, so we don't know that much about them. Their value chains, all of that, still undeveloped, and so the demand for them by the consumers will actually, I think, boost the research interest in studying them. And it's great that the center is actually invested in orphan crops now, teff, millets, cassava. So yeah,
Absolutely right.
there's a lot of.
Any thoughts from you, Don?
So come on a field trip with me to see some of this technology in action, and let's go meet a few smallholder farmers and see what they've got to think. But on a more serious note, much of the work that we do is supported by foundations such as the Gates Foundation, but also very significantly by the U.S. government, by the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is a part of the State Department. And to the extent that we all can, to try and advocate that our government continues to invest in international development, in agriculture, in different places in Africa and around the rest of the world, because it is truly important, not only to improving the livelihoods of people, but also in making sure that we have a more stable world, and that there are all kinds of good reasons for it. I think it was Lenin who said, every society is only 3 meals away from chaos. So it is important that we all kind of look outward and work together to try and improve you know, food security, income security for everybody globally in that.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And while we hear a lot of sobering things about Africa, there's actually a lot of really cool things happening that can make a big impact there. I work for an early stage company called Benson Hill that was born out of research that came from here in the center. And I was recently talking to someone from a coast who works for a foundation, and she said, "Where are you guys located?" And I said, "We were in St. Louis." And she said, "Another ag tech company in St. Louis? What is going on there?" And I said, "Well, the vision that Dr. Danforth planted about 20 years ago to create an ag innovation hub in this city is coming to fruition. And there's a lot of really cool new innovations that are coming that can have some particular application to solve some of these chronic challenges in Africa." And I was wondering if you guys wanted to comment on anything about that.
I agree. I think there's a great appetite for those innovations, and I believe, you know, really Africa is the next frontier for, you know, the use of science and technology to ensure global food security.
So let's turn now to some audience questions. The first one here: how can we reach the smallholder farmers to bring them more advanced farming and technology?
I think one of the things that, you know, we have to think about as we're engaged in all of these projects is how to make them sustainable and how to get them out to smallholder farmers. You know, one of the issues and the challenges is that there are so many of them, and they're on small pieces of land. It's very fragmented. You know, if you think about outside of Africa, think about India as an example, where there are 700 million farmers. How do you get technology out to 700 million farmers? Well, you know, it's an analogous situation in many places in Africa. So over and above going the traditional route of using sort of national schemes for distributing seed and planting material, I think we really have to involve the private sector in a way so that, you know, we can leave these projects with a sustainable solution that will sort of persist, because, you know, we can't be in it forever. The donors that fund this work can't be in it forever either. At a certain point, all of this stuff has to become self-sustaining. And I think that means it has to involve the private sector. And so small companies in Uganda or Kenya or Nigeria that are going to somehow be involved in distributing this technology or the seeds.
Yeah, I agree. I think schools and young students are also a great opportunity through, you know, teaching about some of these technologies in their curricula. Mm-hmm. To just inform them, because they're really the next generation's leaders. If they don't know anything about it, they will just believe the misconceptions. So I believe education, especially to the younger generation, is critical in schools.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So here's a real practical one. Are there communication challenges when working with smallholder farmers who speak a different language? And there are a lot of languages.
What do you think, Ruth?
Yes, it's true. There are communication. So you speak through a translator, or you kind of watch or demonstrate through actions and kind of use sign language. But there are those challenges, it's true. Because when I worked in northern Uganda, everybody spoke a different language than I did. And so if, you know, some of the farmers couldn't speak, or if they didn't speak or understand English, we couldn't really communicate easily. And so that becomes a challenge.
I think we have to try and think of sort of new ways of doing the communication. And, you know, I was surprised to hear that for the example that I cited around the cassava brown streak disease and that there really wasn't even a word or a phrase in the local language that described the disease. And so how do you go about communicating that you've got a cure for the disease when you can't even talk about the disease, and let alone how you sort of created the cure and the technology that was used? Mm-hmm. It's a huge challenge. Yeah.
One of the things I've seen, though, just to address that, is different electronic platforms. Mm-hmm. So there was one company that basically had videos of different, explanations of the best practices farmers could use, and they had them in many languages, and they would be able to travel around and use whatever they needed to for wherever they were. And of course, telephones.
Yeah.
The cell phones are pretty, well, 2/3 of the people don't have access to clean water. About 90% have access to a cell phone.
Cell phones, the key.
So I'd like you to share a little bit of your thoughts on some of the things that we should be most optimistic about related to what's happening on the continent.
Okay. So you cited a number of statistics in your opening, Natalie.
Yeah, I like statistics.
And so I'll cite another one that I read. And it was a prediction that by about 2030, the food and beverage industry in Africa will be a $1 trillion industry, which sounds to me like that's a tremendous opportunity for smallholder farmers, because you said that 80% of the farmers in Africa are smallholders, or they're producing 80% of the food. And so I think if they can capitalize on sort of the digital transformation, the access to information about crops, agronomy, markets, buyers, providers of inputs, and that there's a tremendous opportunity then for smallholders to be able to cash in on the potential $1 trillion market for food and food products in Africa.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's tremendous potential. Africa is a continent with many countries that have rich diversity in people, animals, plants. So there's incredible potential that's been underexploited yet. So there is a lot of promise for just being able to use science and technology to contribute to global food security challenges. I think about in Uganda, majority of the crop production that we do is without fertilizer, is without optimal agronomic practices. And yet we're able to get enough to feed our families, we're able to get enough to sometimes export. My in-laws have a coffee plantation of sorts, 2 acres of coffee. All they do is, coffee is perennial. All they do is go out there and pick the berries. And they're short of labor, so whatever overload just falls to the ground. And this is without fertilizer. They're able to get, 60 kilos from 2 acres that they sell for close to 10 million Uganda shillings. The rate is, $1 for 3,500 Uganda shillings. But anyhow, the point is we're really still below what we could do, and we could do so much better. So there's a lot of potential. So
one last question, and I'm going to direct this to you, Ruth, because I'm curious about this one too. Do you go back to Uganda?
Yes.
Much?
Yes.
And how have you seen things changing?
Oh, things have changed some, and maybe not really changed. The changes that we see that are good are that a lot of my generation of graduates are actually taking up farming. So I have friends and colleagues, peers that are engineers, that are medical doctors, that own a smallholder, a plot of land. And that generation of farmers is actually more empowered to demand for better. They will not settle for 1 ton per hectare from their cornfield. They will demand for better. They will demand for the improved varieties. And so I feel like that's very exciting because the more we get of these kinds of empowered smallholders, the quicker I feel like the trends will change to where we we start to see a deployment of science and innovation and technology and improvements in our yields. So
I like that, Ruth. Fist pumping, don't you guys? Okay, before I invite Dr. Carrington to the stage, please join me in thanking Ruth and Don for sharing their stories with us.
Wait, don't leave. Don't leave. First, thank you all for coming. In many ways, this was a little bit different than what we've done at other conversations for the reasons I'm going to say right now. I want to go around and thank each one of you. Don, thank you so much for your participation. Many of you who have been around the Danforth Center for a period of time, perhaps many years, might take for granted that we have people like Don here at the Danforth Center. Most places that are seeking to use plant science to do something good in the world don't have people like Don who know how, in a public initiative or in the public domain, how to take the fruits of our scientific progress and translate them into a product on the ground. This differentiates us at the Danforth Center, and we're extremely proud and fortunate to have Don here. I'm also happy that he mentioned the word collaboration. Nothing that we do that seeks to reach smallholder farmers around the world is done in isolation here at the Danforth Center. It is all done and only done in collaboration with people on the ground in the countries, in the geographies we seek to impact. And that's the key. Collaboration is one of our core values here at the Danforth Center, and I think you see through Don's effort why that is. Ruth, thank you so much. Ruth illustrates, I think, brilliantly what this is all about. Plant science is a lot of fun if you're a plant scientist, and it is really important if you worry about things like grand challenges and global food security. But when you really get down to it, these plant science that we're interested in is about people. So Ruth, thank you so much for telling your story. It is about people, and it's about empowering people. It's about food security is equivalent to economic security. And as has been demonstrated in many places around the world, the most efficient route to bring impoverished populations that have a high proportion of smallholder farmers upwardly mobile economically is to improve agriculture. It's been demonstrated time and time again around the world and has been studied and proven by organizations like the Gates Foundation. Thank you, Ruth, for telling your story. And finally, Natalie, thank you so much for moderating the conversation this evening. Thank you so much for representing one of our great small companies here in St. Louis, Benson Hill Biosystems, which we're more than proud to have an affiliation with here at the Danforth Center. Soon, Benson Hill's headquarters will be housed here on the Danforth Center campus on the site where you see the construction on the northeast part of campus. Thank you also for being in an organization, a private organization, that has taken not only an interest but an active role in impacting smallholder farmers and addressing crops that don't receive a lot of attention, but that billions of people depend on. We admire that. Thank you all for your participation in the terrific conversation. And again, thank you all for coming. Come back again in October for the next issue of Conversation, and have a good evening.